Hi, and welcome. We're into looking at memory, and this is part one. Now, our memory is pretty intriguing, isn't it? It can be so frustrating at times when our memory doesn't serve us well, like forgetting the phone number of someone you would like to really go out with. Or sometimes when you're even more frustrating is when, of course, you're studying for an exam and you can't recall important information on the exam. Now, on the other hand, we feel great when our memory does serve us well, such as remembering how to get somewhere you haven't been in a long time, like a friend's summer cottage, or out on the town with friends to a particular person's house you haven't been to for a while. So in this part one, we're going to explore our memory process, the nature of remembering, and the factors that influence retrieval. So let's get started. Now, there are three processes involved in remembering, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. And the first one is encoding. Now, encoding involves the transforming of information into a form that can be stored in memory. Now, we must pay attention to material in order for it to be encoded, and that's a critical, important first step. Encoding means putting it into a form, whether that be in our language or in concept mapping, in some form that allows us to encode it correctly for us to be able to put it into our memory. And on top of that you must pay attention to it. That if you're doing something else over here while trying to study and going back and forth, that's not paying attention, and therefore, as we'll see towards the end of the video, that may explain some of the errors that we have that we can participate in not remembering things. So encoding is the first place. The second is storage. Now, that's the maintaining of information in memory, and there are some physiological changes that occur in our brain that supports the memory that has been put there. That physiological change is known as consolidation. Now, retrieval, this is bringing stored materials to mind, and that's what we do when we retrieve our memories, is that we're bringing back this stored information to mind. Now, if we haven't coded it into storage correctly, then we may not be able to find it. It's not unlike a filing cabinet. If you take things out in a very orderly manner but put them in haphazardly, over time they get all muddled and mixed up, making retrieval of information really hard. Now, memory failure, so the three stages, let's review: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Okay? Now, I've already mentioned that memory failure can occur in encoding. Well, memory failure can occur at any of the three stages. Poor encoding or errors in encoding, not actually getting things into storage or putting them in a manner that makes it hard to retrieve, and then retrieval, not being able to retrieve the information that's been stored in our mind. So we'll look at a couple of theories. Now, one of the more familiar ones, at least in a psychological perspective, is what's known as information processing theory, which uses computer models and computer terminology to describe human cognitive functioning. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory is an information processing model that proposes three memory storage systems: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Now, chances are you're familiar with short-term and long-term memory, but you may not be as familiar with sensory, and you may not really understand short-term and long-term memory as well as you may have thought. So let's review. We'll look at this system a little more carefully, and we're going to start with the sensory memory. Sensory memory holds visual images, such as a lightning bolt, for a fraction of a second, just long enough for you to perceive a flow of movement. Now, that seems like not very useful, but it is the kind of usefulness that allows us to sort of scan a bunch of information, get cursory information, and be able to determine what of this needs to have our attention. So the visual sensory memory, it has a capacity of a fraction of a second. And auditory sensory memory lasts a little longer, maybe 2 seconds. Sensory memory allows us to survey the important information long enough to draw things to our attention, which we pay attention to, and that's when we start to entertain this notion of the short-term memory. And it's a temporary store that picks up information from the sensory memory for further processing. Now, what's important about the short-term memory is that it codes information according to sound. The letter T is remembered as a sound T, T-E-E, not the shape of the letter T. It's also, this area of short-term memory is also known as the working memory. Now, it only has a capacity of about 7 bits of information, give or take 2 bits, so 5 to 9 bits of information. Like a phone number is 7, a typical without the area code. You add the area code, and now you've cranked it up to 10, and that sometimes can be outside our range. Now, there are solutions to this, and you've probably used them. So the information is held only about 30 seconds in short-term memory. And it's usually actively processed, unless it's actively plotted. So if I don't pay attention to it and then start to create my learning strategies or my memory strategies in play to actually move things to long term, then it's in short term and leaves. Now, this in short term and leaves is called displacement, and it occurs when it occurs, the information previously stored in short term memory is lost. Each new incoming then pushes out the existing item. You get new, it pushes out the old. New pushes out the old. Now, one of the ways, and I alluded to this, that you can use your short-term memory to actually process to long-term and remember things that are longer than just 7 bytes is what's known as chunking. And you'll see some examples I've put on my screen behind me. Grouping or organizing bits of information into larger units. This reduces the information to a number of pieces that the short-term memory can manage. So grouping OHIP. OHIP is the Ontario Health Insurance Plan. Your driver's license numbers, you might be able to chunk those down into small chunks. Like you see behind. Telephone numbers, it might be in 2, 3, and then 4, or 3 chunks. It's your approach might be unique to you. Information can be kept in short-term memory by rehearsal. Now, that's an important element, and we'll come back to that towards the end. And looking at memory, that one way to improve memory is to don't just to review it once, but you need to rehearse it and go over it and go over it. And there's some other terms that we'll use when we get to that point. Short-term memory also acts as a mental workplace where we can carry out mental activities. That's where the term working memory comes from. And here, in order to work on things, we might employ memory strategies, repeating, rehearsing, chunking, mnemonics, overlearning, and we'll come back to those. According to the levels of processing model, we are more likely to remember something for an extended period of time if we process the information on a deeper level. Shallow processing involves our sensory awareness of stimuli, while deeper processing takes place when we perform some action on the stimuli or information. Some of these actions are forming a relationship, making associations, or attaching meaning to sensory information. So the more we work with information in short term, so when you're studying, the more you make associations between what your new learning is with what you've already learned or past experience, or the more you can chunk things down and rehearse things, the more likely things will get into long-term memory reliably. So the long-term memory, this is the third memory system. Think of your long-term memory as a vast storehouse of information, general and specific information containing names, dates, places, past experiences, knowledges that you've acquired. And when you think of your long-term, there's two long-term memories that are work together, if you will. You've got declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Declarative memory holds facts and information in either on either of the two forms. Either it's there's two forms of declarative memory. There's semantic memory. This is our general knowledge. It's kind of like our mental encyclopedia and dictionary. And then there's the episodic memory, and this is more like our personal life experiences, our diary of ourself, but it's more detailed than typically a diary might be. Then there's non-declarative memory, and this consists of motor skills acquired through repetitive practice, habits, simply classically conditioned responses. This is also known as implicit memory. It's not unlike when you learn to ride a bicycle, and you ride it as a child and through your teens, and then after many years of not having ridden a bike opportunity comes up, you jump on the bike, and you for the most part can ride the bike just fine. You may not be as skilled as some of the other bikers who have biked a lot longer than you have, but you can ride a bike. Now, to measure memory, we can look at three methods to measure. One is called recall, recognition, and then the third is relearning. So recall, this is where information must be supplied with few or no retrieval cues, remembering cold, no prompts. So when you maybe you're just sitting enjoying a little, quiet time on the deck, and some past experiences just emerge into your thought, and you start sort of reliving some past experiences. That's called recall. No prompts, no cues to say, do you remember when, and indicate some. Those are cues. So when we go to recognition, this is the second method, where the information must simply be recognized by having been encountered before. So like when you study for a test and you read the question and you answer it, you are recognizing the things that you have studied. If you don't study, there's a limited recognition because you haven't seen it before, or you have very poor recollection of it. So for example, maybe you have a question on your test. B.F. Skinner was a founder of operant conditioning theory, true or false? Now you've had a prompt, and having read this before and have the familiarity, yes, that's true. To use a retrieval cue, you give hints about the information that's required. Perhaps that question rephrased might be, the founder of operant condition theory was BF, and then there's a line indicating fill in the blank. You having had that cue, or that retrieval cue, operant conditioning founder, BF, well, the only person I remember in my reading from my studying, I know that to be B.F. Skinner. The third level, or the third form or method of memory, is then relearning method. Now, this measures retention in terms of time saved in relearning material compared to the time required to learn it originally. Any information that you learn for the first time takes, maybe let's just say 10 units of time. And then years pass and you are introduced to this material again, and you're sort of relearning. It will take you perhaps half the time to learn this information you knew from 10 years earlier. It has for a long time been thought that our memory works like a videotape recorder. However, more current research suggests that our memory is not a complete and accurate record of our life. Rather, we reconstruct memories, piecing them together from a few highlights, and using information that may or may not be accurate. So why might we have some of these inaccuracies? I kind of thought we were operating on once I know it, I have it, and I'll never forget it. Well, there are these there's this term called schemas, and these are the integrated frameworks of knowledge and assumptions that we have about people, objects, and events, where schemas affect how we encode and recall information. They assist us in processing and understanding vast amounts of stimuli because these schemes were developed over a lifetime, and they're still unique to each of us. So essentially, after a period of time in my life, I start to develop these sort of, if I will, boxes, that when I see letters, and I know them to be symbols of, what are put together will be words, and I put them into a box of, these will be my collection of letters that form words. This is my box for what constitutes a cat and a dog and a horse, a house, and I have all of these schemas that I understand that when I see something I haven't seen before, but it resembles one of my boxes, I can draw some conclusions, perhaps, that this is another form of this sort of thinking. So it's a shortcut. It's not, when we sort of consider over our lifetime and how it might be unique for each of us, well, consider that each of us have a different life experience. We've had different family experiences. We may have lived different geographies. And when we receive new information, we tend to try to fit things into what we already know. And in doing so, we may distort or forget some information. Thus, we have somewhat inaccurate memories. Now, how accurate is our memory? Well, if we consider eyewitness testimony, the reliability of eyewitness testimony is reduced when witnesses view a photograph of a suspect before viewing the lineup. When members of the line are viewed at the same time, rather than one by one, the perpetrator is of a different race, then that from the eyewitness, then we find that people's accurate memories for eyewitness accounts aren't so strong. So it's often been argued, if you will, that, well, if you're hypnotized, you remember everything precisely as things were. Well, hypnotized subjects supply more information and are more confident of their recollections, but they supply more inaccurate information as well. Rather than improving memory retrieval, hypnosis makes the creation of false memories more likely. False memory syndrome. This is the creation of false or inaccurate memories through suggestion, especially while hypnotized. False memories may be more likely to be formed for plausible false events than for your implausible ones. So when we consider the two examples of unusual memory, there's two that come to mind, and you'll find them in your textbook. One is flashbulb memory, and the other is photographic memory. The flashbulb memory is an extremely vivid memory of the conditions surrounding one's first hearing news of a surprising or shocking or highly emotional event. For example, when you heard or watched the 9/11 World Trade Center terrorist attack, or the news of the Montreal Massacre in 1989, or any other emotional event, this recall may come back kind of like a flashbulb, and you'll have the immediate emotional reaction that you may have had at the time. Photographic memory is also its more accurate term is eidetic imagery. This is the ability to retain the image of a visual stimulus several minutes after it's been removed from view. Now, there are lots of examples of people's memories that are far more significant than that. The guy that I have on screen there is Stephen Whitshire. He's able to be taken up in a helicopter over any city for 15 minutes, 20 minutes circling around, and then drop him back at his studio, and he'll sit and draw a 20 by 6 foot drawing accurately of what he saw. He has that strong a visual memory that it'll last for days, and he can work on his drawings for days and have great recall. They've checked the windows in particular buildings in Rome and the city around the Acropolis are all exactly correct. So those are unique. They're not common. So now let's look at some of the factors that can influence our memory retrieval. The serial position effect is the tendency when a person is recalling a list of items to remember the items at the beginning of the list. That's primacy effect. Or the items at the end of the list, recency effect. Now, for example, you might be maybe you have a child, or maybe you can remember when you were young, your mom or your dad had asked you to go do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things. Okay, there's the list. Primacy effect is if you've gone and come back with the first 3 things. Recency effect was that you came back with only the last 3 things, but you forgot the first 6 or 7. So that's common in terms of how we understand our memory retrieval, is that there could be problems on either end. Now, we are more likely to remember information if we are in the same location or the environmental context as we were when it was originally encoded. So, for example, if you studied really hard for a test in your room, in a study room that you've created in your apartment or in your house, and you study and study and study there, and then you go to the classroom and you don't do as well as you think because you studied so hard. Sometimes memory is held to the environment unless you generalize it and do more with that information in storage rather than just sort of memorizing. And that's what often happens when we just reread and reread and reread. And then when we get here, the environment is different, and therefore our retrieval can sometimes be different. State-dependent memory effect is our tendency to recall information better if we are in the same pharmacological or psychological state when the information was learned. So like context specific, an environment, your room is the place that you studied, so if you were able to do your tests there, you'd probably do much better than if you did it in the classroom. The state-dependent would mean if you were relaxed, you had nice music on, something that you enjoy that's quiet, you did your studying, you got information in, and you were in a good mood, and then when you got into the classroom to write the test, you got panicky. That panickiness is not the same state that you are in when you were studying, and sometimes that doesn't transfer very well. Now that's been a quick overview of and the end of part 1 on memory. Now we're going to look at the biology of memory, forgetting, and what you can do to improve your memory in part 2. So look for it in part 2 in the following week. Good luck, everybody.